All right, all right, ladies and gentlemen. Right, today is another good day the Lord have made. We mustn't take it for granted. Gave us the air in our lungs, gave us food to eat. Right, the most important thing is life. Gave us life, of which no one deserves it. We don't deserve anything because we are all sinners. But as the Bible said, His mercies are renewed every day. So today is another day of His grace. So we thank Him for everything. And I would like us to commit this lecture into His hand. We humbly ask for His guidance, for His wisdom, to be able to understand what we are going to do today. We totally depend on Him in everything. There is nothing we can achieve on our own, right? Okay. Now, let's take off. Let's start. Remember what we're doing, right? The final topic, which is evaluation, project evaluation. Like I said, project evaluation is very, very important, right? For example, when you set out to do something, and at the end of your journey, you should be able to look back to see whether what you've done is exactly what you started out to do. It's very important. That is how wise people, rational people, they do things. Right. Please sit down quietly. Sit down quietly. Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But you go and finish it. But let me continue with the lecture. Then I will upload it. You watch it on YouTube. Right. But all of you, some people must stay behind. Okay, you can go. So, like I said, you need to be able to look back and see whether you've achieved what you predetermined to achieve at the beginning as far as your project objectives is concerned. Right. Remember, project is capital intensive. You spend money. It involves usage of resources. You wouldn't like perhaps at the end of the day you've expended your resources without achieving your goals. Do you understand what I mean? Right. For example, let's assume that you are a founder, you sponsor, right, projects. Obviously, you would like to have a good returns of, although you might not be looking for profit or returns to your investment, but the returns I'm talking about now, in terms of, let's say, non-governmental organization funding or those kind of stuff, the value of that project could, one can take it as a sort of returns to your investment. So you wouldn't like a situation whereby you sponsor a project and at the end of the day, what you intended to achieve are not achieved or it's not achieved. Right. So what is going to happen in that kind of space? You're going to be demotivated. Right. So you would always like to know whether you've achieved what you set out to achieve so that you can be motivated to do more, right, for future projects. And if what you set out to achieve is not achieved, then you need to query it in terms of trying to know what went wrong. Right. Based on that, you can be able to formulate strategies based on lessons learned, formulate a kind of recommendation that one could advance for one to improve right? Improve for future projects, right? So we've talked about the principles of evaluation. We've done that, whereby we talk about the credibility of the evaluation outcomes. Of course, it has to be credible. We talk about the made up or the traits of the evaluators. We said they should be knowledgeable and they should act in a kind of what we call impartial form. Then we talk about involving the stakeholders as one of the principles. You must always involve key stakeholders for you to be able to do a credible project evaluation. Right. Remember, I told you that project evaluation can take place 3 times in a project, right? I said few months after starting the project or 6 months. It depends on the duration of the project, right? So let's say it's a project of 3 years or whatever. 6 months after the commencement of the project, then you can go out there and do a kind of evaluation to see whether the design is properly or is in order. You need to look at how things are going. So if eventually during your evaluation, your first evaluation, you discover that what was designed is not in conformity with what is in space or in reality. So you need to make a kind of adjustment on time before things gets out of hand. Right. So you need to know that. Then remember I told you an evaluation can also be done after the end of the project, whereby you need to look at the resources that were expended in terms of the usage. Here we talk in terms of effectiveness and efficiency and all those kind of stuff. Right. Then afterwards, let's say some 6 months or 1 year, as the case may be, after the completion of the project, you can as well come back again to look at, to review the project in terms of the impact of the project, the type of change that is emanating from the project or that's being performed in terms of what I'm trying to say now is this: you need to look at the changes that is being brought as a result of the project outcomes. So those are the things that you need to look at. Of course, you can look at the sustainability, right? The sustainability of the project in terms of the project being able to replicate itself and continue without being discontinued. Yeah. So those are the stuff. Okay, you can leave it and then. Oh man, you a little bit confused. No problem. I'm small. Just quickly in the meeting, otherwise I would have asked. Okay. Okay, so this is page one, two, three, and then it's four. Yeah. So while it's saying this document consists of five. Don't worry about that. So okay. Yeah. So that is the students' okay. The worksheet. Yes, this is the lecturer's checklist. Okay. At the back we have the students' checklist. Okay. But the ma'am said you must work or mock. Yeah, on that. Yes. Yeah. So now I have 33. Yeah. 34 at the back. So all of these are like this, no? Yeah. And then I have these other pages that is saying 41, 42. Don't worry about the pages. Don't worry. So should I just attach these? No, just leave it. I think I can sort this thing out by myself. So I should attach it together. Like no, these. Don't worry. So I should just bring it because I already attached the level 4's ISETs. Okay. So I'm gonna bring that. Yeah. And then do level 2's one. Yeah. And then I'm bringing this. Yeah. So I'm bringing this here by you. Okay. But mind you, you are on air, no? I know. Okay. All right. Okay. No, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Right. Okay, guys. So as we were saying, let's say when you've done with your evaluation, your review, perhaps you discover that there were certain things that needs to be fixed, right? Then those things that can be fixed has to be have to be fixed. So if there are certain things that cannot be fixed, then what you need to do, you institute what we call a process improvement. We shall come to that, right? Okay, like what we have here. Hello, focus. We say final product evaluation. This is done to determine the overall quality of the final product. Of course, that is what I've talked about. Evaluate the product against the original objectives. We talk about that as well. Then identifies identifies outages in the final product. What do we mean by outages? Outages means could be something of errors, mistakes. Outages means, yeah, we are talking in terms of mistakes or errors. For example, if there is an error in the design, right, you need to correct it. Errors or mistakes, that is what we refer to as outages in the final product, right? Then determine how to address any outage. When you discover that there is perhaps an error in the design, right? Remember, if there's an error in the design and if it is not corrected, it's gonna have an impact on the final product. You know what we mean by the final product? Okay, for example, let's look at the building for 4IR, right? It was designed, then it was now it's constructed. What you are looking here now, as it is not a project again, it's the product, right, of the project. So let's assume that at the end of the construction, then you discover that there is an error in the final product. Perhaps let's say there was an error in the design. So now that thing was not corrected. So it's reporting now on the final product. So what you're gonna do, you need to make sure that you institute a kind of maintenance, right? Listen, you need to institute a kind of a process maintenance to maintain it, right? Okay, let me give you a simplified example that you can be able to comprehend. Let's say the building, the way it was designed, right? The roof was not designed properly. Now the wind is affecting the roof, which make water to be getting inside the building. So are you going to leave it like that? No, you must look for a way to rectify that error, which is that outage we are talking about. Does it make sense to you? Right. So define how to address any outage. Perhaps implement a mechanism for improving or maintaining the quality, which is the maintenance program. Right. When you're done with a project, like I said, the outcome or part of the deliverable is, we call it the product of the project. You don't have to leave it like that because that product of the product or the product of the project is going to be there to serve its purpose. So you must also look for a way to institute a maintenance program to be maintaining the product of the project. For example, this building now, will you leave it like that? It has to be maintained. So that is what we are talking about. So there should be a program that needs to be instituted to maintain the project throughout the lifetime of the project. You cannot just leave it like that. Then, how do you initiate a maintenance process? Right? How do you do that? That is what we're going to. So we say if there is a need for ongoing maintenance of the final product, a maintenance process should be initiated, like I said. So a maintenance process, what is it all about? It's a formal or defined process that involves business and technical staff in the identification of the work, approval of work, carrying out of the work, and quality control of the work. Anyhow, this statement is very long for you, but the bottom line is this: what you need to understand is there should be a way, right, on how the team must sit together and institute a kind of a maintenance plan on how the product of the project is going to be maintained to enhance its usefulness throughout the lifetime of the product. That is what we are trying to say here. Then the process improvement, what does it involve? It involves process improvement is conducted to review and update the process used by the project manager. Okay, what we are talking about in terms of the process improvement. Process improvement is quite different from the maintenance program, right? Process improvement is this. For example, right, how does it come in? You look at the project, you review it. Perhaps you discover that the outage, which is the error, the mistakes, is not in the design, but it was in the process that was used to implement the project. So you don't want a situation whereby such mistake occur again. What you need to do now is you take it as a lessons learned and look for how you can be able to improve on it. Right. I will tell this guy next time mustn't put that is a phone, right? Next time they mustn't put their phone here. Remove it from the charger. Then when the person comes, I will tell that person not to do that again. All right. Okay, sorry for that. Now, what you need to do again is this. So we say process improvement is conducted to review and update the process used by the project manager. Right. We are talking about the process now, right? Not the design, right? Not the resources, but the process that was used. Perhaps you could have used process that is not well refined. So what you need to do is you make sure that you review the process. Once it is reviewed, then you correct the errors. So next time you will not repeat the same stuff, the same errors. So it involved both technical and business staff, as the case may be. Then it covered the whole project process, the techniques that was used by the organization, identify the things that work well, right? Because when you are looking at the process, you are looking at the process, reviewing the process in a holistic manner. Not only what was done right or what was done wrong. You must look at it, review it, for you, from there, you will be able to determine or establish what were done wrong and what were done right as well. Right? You identify the things that work well, of course, like I said, what went well, what you did well, or the processes that went well, if you will. Then you need to identify the things that didn't work. Right? Then you identify things that were not necessary. There could be some processes, some techniques, some procedures that were unnecessary, right? That were followed. So those on this earth will constitute a kind of wastage. So you need to identify. Wherever you've identified such, then you know now that next time these resources or these processes were not necessary. There was no need of going through those processes. So it should be all those processes should be eliminated next time for on future project. Then you identify additional things that were necessary. Of course, when you identify things that were not necessary, like, there could be some stuff that were necessary but were not incorporated. So you need to identify such as such. Then improve the estimating model for the process, the way the model that you use in estimating perhaps the cost of the project, the duration of the project, and all those kind of stuff. so that the organization can learn from the project and make similar future projects more successful. So that is the bottom line. You review the process for you to be able to know what went wrong, what went right, what were the things that were unnecessary, that were incorporated, that were not supposed in the first place to be there, and what were the additional stuff that were needed that were not there. So it helps you to prepare your lessons learned, right? For you to know, learn from the project, and for or you again to improve on future projects. Does it make sense to you? Right. Then there are steps that needs to be followed. Guys, listen to me. This thing is very important. Hello, I see you are busy doing some other stuff. Yeah, this one is very important. The steps that needs to be followed for process improvement, right? Remember, I told you what a process improvement is. You're looking at the processes that were followed in executing the project. So at this point in time, you're coming back to review it to see what were done, how were those things done, right? The processes that were followed, were there things that were not done right, as well as the things that were done right, things that were unnecessary that were incorporated in the process, and as well as additional things that were supposed to be there to improve the process that were not there. Right, as a lessons learned. Then these are the processes that needs to be followed. Right. One, you prepare end of project review. Because the project needs to be ended, right? Needs to be completed. Then you prepare for the review itself, right? It's not something that you just wake up from slumber. I'm going to do a project review. You must prepare for it because there are resources that are needed, right? You must prepare, make a plan. You must have a schedule. Those resources that are needed needs to be mobilized. It takes time, it takes money for you to mobilize those resources. So you need to prepare for it. That is why we say the first step is to prepare end of project review. End of project review, end of the project. Project review means project evaluation, right? Then you conduct the end of project review. You prepare for it. This is how I'm going to do it. It's going to take place at a specified date. These are the resources that is going to be involved. When we talk about resources now, remember, people are going to be involved, human capital, right? Then money is going to be to be involved, right? Which is financial capital. Then you need to talk about the time as well, the knowledge as well. So you need to make sure that you've done a thorough preparation before you set out. So the second step, then you implement, you not implement, you conduct the project review, right? So having done your project review, remember during the project review, you're gonna look at the processes as well as the resources, what were used, and the progress and all those stuff. Then you update the process metric. Having done your review now, right? Perhaps you discover that there were certain things that were unnecessary, or there were certain things that were supposed to be there that were not incorporated, right? There were certain things that were done right, and there were as well certain things that were not done right. So for you to improve on that process, you need to update the process metric, right? Then you implement the process improvement. Like I said, these four processes or these four steps I mean, sorry to say, are very important. Process improvement. Step to follow for process improvement. They can ask you in the exam. Right. Okay, let's see. We are trying to unpack the four steps now. We are trying to unpack the four steps so that you know comprehensively what are involved or involved, yeah. Then step one, prepare end of project review. Remember I say you must prepare for it, right? Okay, let's say, determine what the final review of the project should be. And this could be meeting, okay, the mode. How are you going to do the project review, right? Is this something that you are going to facilitate it through meetings, or it's going to be through workshop or questionnaires? Remember, project review as it is a research base, right? Whereby you need to involve the key stakeholders. Remember, when we're talking about the principles of project evaluation, right? So there are certain principles that need to be adhered to, and there are certain criteria that one needs to put into consideration. So here, when you are preparing for the project review, remember what I told you earlier on. Project review and project evaluation is the same, right? Okay. So now, while preparing for the project review or the project evaluation, if you will, you need to determine the format it's going to take, right? How are you going to do it? Is this something that you're going to hold meetings whereby people will be talking, giving their own perspective or opinion about regarding how the project was done? You know, from there you can be able to evaluate the project, right? Whereby you can call people, it depends on the type of project and it depends on the context, right? So if you want to review your project by way of meeting with the key stakeholders, it can be done, right? Face to face, you interact with them, then they can be able to raise points to tell you, give their own perspective, give their own opinion about the project. That can be utilized. Or workshop, which is more or less like face-to-face dialogue as well. Then questionnaires. You can use questionnaires. You design questionnaires, then you incorporate in your questionnaire relevant questions pertaining to the project. Then you distribute it to them to respond. Then you collect it back. Then you analyze it. Based on your findings, you can be able to establish if the process was uh, well formulated or was well followed. Right. You can be able to do that. So this one is part of the preparation. These ones are part of the preparation. Does it make sense to you? Now, the second step is you conduct end of a project review. The first one is for you to prepare, right? Then the second step is for you to carry out what you plan, because that first part is the planning stage. Then here you need to execute, conduct the process review, right? We said this should be conducted as per the selected methods in step one. What methods are we talking about there? For example, if you said, or if you've decided to go by way of meeting, or workshop or questionnaires, right? So from what you've selected in step one, here you need to put it into practice, right? So recommended changes to the process and estimating model should be recorded while implementing it. Then step three, here you update the process metric. So the evaluator review the recommended changes to the estimating model. So in step two, you do the review, right? So whatever findings, of course, there will be findings as well as recommendation. So that recommendation needs to be implemented here at step three, where you need to update the system, the process. Then implement a process improvement. So evaluator should review the recommended changes, right? Of course, the recommendation is going to be based on the findings. To the standard process used, then you assess each change and decide if it is likely to apply, to future projects of this type. There you have to decide. For example, if it is going to be applicable to replica or a similar project of such, you know what I mean? Then change the standard process based on the decision. Okay, so that is the First step, those are the first steps that you need to follow. Then you implement, then you need to carry it out, then you update the process matrix. And yeah. So let's talk about this project post-mortem review questions. So what are we trying to say here now? When you are reviewing a project, remember the project has been completed, right? The project has been completed. So you want to know how the project was done. You want to know whether the process that was followed was the right one. You want to know whether the resources were optimally utilized. You want to look at the progress. You want to look at the achievement of the project against the objectives. So that is what essentially what you do at project or during project review. So we here I'm going to teach you the type of questions that needs to be posed to the key stakeholders for you to be able to establish that can enable you to get credible answers or responses that can help you to determine or to establish if the project was done according to uh, the way it should be done to achieve project objectives. So we call it postmortem. Postmortem is, for example, postmortem in medical field, or when we say postmortem examination, when somebody has passed on, you want to establish the cause of that death, or you want to establish the cause of the death of that person. What you do, the forensic, they comes in there to do their own examination. We call it postmortem examination, right? That means after the death. In the same vein, in project management, you do this post-mortem review after the project has been completed. That is why we call it a post-mortem, right? So this will obviously differ from the project to project, depending on the life cycle of the project, right? So the nature and type of post-mortem review, it depends on the type of project, right? And it depends on the context where the project is being executed. That is what we are trying to say here now. So it is divided into various phases. So the phase one, we have to determine the needs and feasibility, right? Okay. So what we are trying to say is when you are reviewing a project, remember, for example, if you decided to use questionnaires, right? Questionnaires, designing certain, formulating certain questions to be responded by the key stakeholders. There is a way you need to formulate the questionnaire so that you can be able to obtain the credible data or credible information from them. So, for example, in the area of determining whether the project was able to meet the needs of the beneficiary or the needs of the community, as the case may be, if it is a project that has to do with the community. So, what type of questions that you could pose? So, these are the type of questions that you could ask, right? For example, you can ask a question of this. Say, did our needs or market analysis or feasibility study identify all the project deliverable that we eventually had to build? Right? Here now, you are trying to establish the whether the needs, right, was the needs were being met. Did our needs through market analysis, right? Market analysis was done at the beginning of the project, right? Because you use market analysis to establish in terms of the strength, the weaknesses, like SWOT, right? Or feasibility study. What do we mean by feasibility study? Feasibility study is being done to establish whether the project can be done, in short. Right. So at the beginning of the project, once you formulate a project, you need to carry out a kind of a feasibility study to see how viable it is, how doable the project is, because there could be, you could formulate a project that is not doable, right? So by way of doing your feasibility study, then you can be well informed as to whether the project is doable or feasible or viable, thereabout, right? Or achievable, right? You can use this acronym SMART. A project objective must be SMART, right? You can use a SMART to do your analysis. Must be specific in terms of the objectives, right? Measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. Those kind of stuff, right? So we said here, did our needs or market analysis or feasibility study identify all the deliverables that we actually had to build at the beginning when you were doing your SWOT, your market analysis, your feasibility study or needs analysis? Were you able to identify all the outcomes of the project? That is what we mean. That's the outcome of the project. Because if you were not able to identify the outcomes of the project, remember, as part of the objectives, as part of the need analysis, you should be able to know what you need to provide in terms of the deliverable to meet with the needs of the beneficiary or the community, if it's a community project. So if at the beginning of the project you were not able to identify that, so at the end of the day, there will be a kind of a gap, right? In which case you will not be able to meet with the needs of the community. There will be certain needs that will not be met because at the beginning you were not able to incorporate those needs as part of your deliverables. Does it make sense to you? That is what I'm trying to say. If not, what did we miss? You see? If not, what did we miss? And how could this be rectified for future purpose? When you were doing your analysis, okay, for example, Yoga, let me give you a practical example. Remember, a project is either to take advantage of an opportunity or to solve a problem, right? A practical solution to a problem. Do you understand? Practicable solution to a problem. Let me put it that way. Okay, let me give you an example of this 4IR, right? This project. Before it was initiated, there was a kind of a need analysis or market analysis or feasibility study, as the case may be, to see, right, to formulate the deliverables. For example, there was a need for us to have a 4IR here, right, to teach our students, right, about the trending, about the trends in 4IR, right? So the building was initiated, the project was initiated, right? So before initiating the project, there were certain objectives that were formulated based on the needs of the student of West Coast College, right? You should be able to teach people, for example, robotic, whereby students can go there and learn how to do programming or something of such, right? Then the project was formulated that at the end of the day, the project should be able to provide such deliverables. Are you getting the picture of what I'm saying? Okay. Let's assume that that aspect, that deliverable aspect of having a space to teach student programs on how to program, do programming activity or programming knowledge. It's not there, or to learn programming knowledge is not there. Then it was formulated. Then the project was done. At the end of the day, you now come to review the project. Then you discover that that component was not incorporated. So what it means now is something is missing. Do you understand what I mean? So now during your review, you need to look out for how you can be able to fill that gap. Because our student wants to know how to do programming, right? And the building is completed. There is no space, there is no component of that as part of the deliverables. So how can you account for that? That is what we are trying to say. Does it make sense to you? Right. So if not, what did we miss? And how could this be rectified for future projects? How are you going to rectify it if there is a need for us to build another 4 arrow building in another campus? Right. Now we've known that this one is missing something. And when you look at the needs, it's basically the same needs. So here we are missing out. So you need to acknowledge that and make sure that future projects you're not going to miss it as well. So that is what we are trying to say. When necessary deliverables identified. So if so, what is the way forward for future purpose? How can we improve our needs feasibility or analysis phase? Right. So what you've done during your analysis, you ended up omitting something, missing a very fundamental deliverable. Right? Now you have to sit down and see to make sure that next time when you are doing your analysis, you do it properly without missing out on the deliverables. That is what we are trying to say here. So phase two, you need to create a project plan. So how does this one work? You need to these are questions that you need to ask. What are we doing? These are questions that will help you to review the project. These are questions that you are going to pose to the key stakeholders. So once you get responses to these questions, then you can be able to know exactly the status of the project in terms of how well the project was done. Right? Then you need to ask here, how accurate were original estimate of the size and effort of our project? Right? What did we over or underestimate? Right? Were there situations whereby the estimate was less or more? Did we have the right people assigned to project roles? The human capital, the employees, the team members that were they assigned the right roles that were compatible to their skills and knowledge? If no, how can we make sure that we get the right people next time? You see, do you see how important this thing is? It will help you to know what to do next time, right? Describe any early warning sign that occur earlier in the project. Was there perhaps any warning sign to tell you that, yay, something is going wrong here or something, right? So if there was, then you take it. Then you create, where are we? Huh? It's break time now. Okay, so we're gonna continue from here next time. Can you help me switch it up? Yeah. Okay.